Today's youth need teachers, volunteers, and most of all, well, they need you. I'm Doug Edwards, and I'm going to be talking with real youth mentors and students to give you the knowledge you need to be the best youth worker possible. This is Youth Worker on Fire. This is another session I have with Lance Kramer from the Arctic. They call you guys the gateway of the Arctic. You're up there. You explained that in the last interview we had last night. What a great time we had. Thank you so much for that. So tell me this. How did you and your wife come to faith in Christ? You told me a little bit about that before we were recording yesterday, but give us, how all of this happened for you.
Yeah, I went to church as a little boy with my grandmother. My parents weren't Christians. My brother and sister weren't Christians. And so my grandmother, she had a lot of grandchildren, but she would have me spend the night, Saturday nights, promising me sourdough hotcakes Sunday morning. So I love sourdough hotcakes, and so I stayed with her Saturday nights, and then Sunday we'd have sourdough hotcakes, and she'd say, okay, wash up, it's time to go to church. And so I went to church with her quite often, and I learned about Jesus and learned about God and heaven and hell and all that. And although, didn't pay a whole lot of attention, but when you're there in a church, you kind of get that culture, you get that understanding, and so had that kind of foundation. And that was great. But when my parents divorced when I was 5, and later, I think when I was 8, went to live with my father. And it really kind of didn't go to church after that very much at all, even through high school, and got my degree in elementary education, and just kind of thinking about my career and my family. Met my wife, Karina, in 89. And then around 92, we had our first daughter. And then 93, we, of course, or 92, we got married. 93, we had our first daughter. And so it was pretty rough going initially because we were Christians, and it was a difficult life, still trying to get my degree and whatnot. And but things came to a head, I think, 1995. My wife, she became a Christian in January of 1995. A friend of hers brought her to church, and she gave her life to Christ. And so I saw the difference in my wife. And again, it wasn't the church, it wasn't a sermon, it wasn't Billy Graham. It was just a change in my wife's life that, it gave me the proof that God is real. And so February 1995, I was out hunting, and normally not supposed to hunt on a Sunday in Eskimo culture, but I did. And long story short, almost died in a snow machine crash, tried to get a black wolf. And I had prayed that day. Earlier that day at church, because the preacher was preaching on the Lamb's Book of Life in the book of Revelation. And he said, anyone's name is not written in the Lamb's Book of Life, you go to lake of fire. Well, I didn't want to go to the lake of fire. And so anyways, I pray, and I asked my wife, how do I pray? What did you pray? And she goes, I don't know how I prayed. You just pray. And I'm like, I don't know how to pray. I don't know what to say. What do I got to do? She said, I don't know. We were pretty clueless. Like, what do you do? What do you say? What are the magic words? And so I just prayed, and I just said, God, I said, if you're real, prove yourself to me. Prove to me that you exist, and I'll give my life to you. And of course, like I said, I went hunting, and our area behind town, the peninsula is mostly flat country, rolling hills. And it was cold. It's February, winter time. I'm on a snow machine, and I looked down, and there's a herd of caribou down below me. And there was when it's cold, their breath makes a fog above them. And so there was a black wolf on the other side of the caribou hunting this caribou herd. And I thought, man, if I can get that black wolf, I'll be considered a man. If you're, an Eskimo, wolf is the apex predator, and if you can get a wolf, man, you're a really good hunter. And you'll get respect in town and amongst your people. And so I thought, I'm going to get this wolf. So I went down off of this hill into the flats and through this caribou herd, and their breath made like a cloak for me, like a cloud. And I was going through it and thinking, okay, I'll use this as a cloak, as a shield, and when I come out into the open, I'll surprise the wolf. I'll be that much closer to him. Well, when I got into the open, out of the caribou breath fog, I looked and I didn't see a wolf in front of me, but there was a deep hole in the tundra. And it was a creek called Riley Wreck. And in the winter, we get east to west winds, and sometimes the snow fills those creeks depending on the angle. Sometimes it fills it all the way and covers it across. Sometimes it fills it only halfway. Sometimes there's a swirl that goes all the way down to ice and it never fills the whole winter. And so it's a little dangerous. And so I fell into like a 10-foot hole. I tried to turn as much as I can, and I did turn a little bit, but fell into this 10-foot hole and crashed and knocked out down there, still sitting on my snow machine, and looked up in this hole eventually, and I thought, what the heck just happened? And, I thought about that prayer. I prayed to God that morning, and I thought, no, hunters are going to fall in holes once in a while. It just comes with the territory. But I looked to the left of me, there was a deeper hole down to solid ice down there, another 10 more feet. If I would have gone down that, I probably would have died. And so I got up out of that, climbed up out of there, and I looked, and it was miles of open country to the left, miles of open country to the right. And there were my snow machine tracks, and they were heading for the deep part of that hole. It was only a few feet that I saw the hole and changed and saved my life. And I realized that perhaps God did save my life. And so I thought, well, okay, I'll go give my life to him then. He saved my life. And because I was heading to the deep part of the hole, I was heading to death. And so I thought, I'm going to go give my life to the Lord right now, tonight, evening service. And then I thought, well, after I killed this black wolf, I might as well be a man and a Christian same day. So I went after this, took a look for this wolf, and I never did find it. And then I thought, well, I'll just go to the church. And so I was actually pretty happy because I thought about this moment for my whole childhood about becoming a Christian. I was very happy, as I was driving to town. And an hour later or so, got into town, didn't even go to my house to drop off my gun or my gear, and just walked into church. Left my gun outside of my snow machine and sat at the back. Very traditional church, the Quaker church, and they sing a lot of hymns on Sunday nights. And I'm thinking, come on, man, let's get on with this, let's do this thing. So fortunately, at the end, the pastor gave the altar call, Eskimo pastor. But, when he gave the altar call, my body wouldn't get up and go. It was like frozen. And I was like talking to myself saying, get up, fool, man, he almost killed you. And I couldn't get up. And so service ended and everybody walked out, and I prayed to God and I said, well, God, I'm sorry about that. I don't know what happened, but I'll come back for the Wednesday night service and I'll try it again. So came back for the Wednesday night service, sat in the same place, but this time, of course, I didn't really want to do it, but I did. I know I promised God that I would be there, so I thought I'll just go there and see what happens. So sure enough, at the end of the service, they did the altar call again, and this time it was opposite. My body got up, and my mine didn't want to go, but my body got up, and it just started walking down the aisle, and it's kind of interesting. So I thought, what the heck's going on? So eventually I got up there, and the pastor asked me if I knew how to fight, and I told him I didn't. I said, that's why I'm up here to you. And so he would grab my hands, and he says, are you a sinner? And I said, yep. I said, one of the worst ones. And he says, you know who Jesus is? I said, yeah, he's the Son of God. He said, do you know what he did for you? I said, yeah, he died on a cross for me, and he buried my sins, he rose again. And he said, well, you need to tell him that now. You just tell him what you told me. And so I prayed, and of course the guy had my hands clasped, and I prayed. I said, God, I'm so sorry for who I am and what I've done, and I know who you are. I know who your son is. I know what he did for me. And I said, best I know how, I'm going to give you my whole life. I said, you can have it from here on out. Do with it whatever you want. And I said, amen. And from that moment, it was pretty strange. I'm not a Pentecostal person, but for some reason I could feel sins leaving my body. I can feel sin leaving, which is really strange. And I never felt so clean after that in my life, completely 100% forgiven. And then I felt completely 100% love all of a sudden. And tears started coming down my face. I can't express the love that I felt and the forgiveness that I felt and the lack of shame and guilt and just 100% acceptance. And so, from that moment on, man, I walked out of there and I was like, wow, this is kind of interesting. This is a real deal. This is not fake. And so, that began my Christian life. And of course, it was nice that my wife was a Christian before I was. We can walk through together the early stages of Christianity. We didn't know what to do. We just thought, okay, well, go to church, I guess. We didn't learn a whole lot, and eventually I started reading my Bible, and my wife, I used actually my wife's NIV study Bible because it had notes on it, and I can understand when I read the notes, right, under the scriptures. And it was through that I really began to self-learn, basically. And eventually we moved down to Eagle River. I got my degree in elementary education. I taught for a couple of years, and I remember the second year after I got done teaching, it was time to sign my contract. But God, it was strange. I was at a whiteboard with my fourth graders at the end of school, and I remember I was teaching them fractions, and then I heard a voice, and it says, "Fractions are only good for baking cookies." That's what the voice said, and must be God's way of chatting to me, I reckon. But and then he says, "I want you to teach them about me." And I remember I was up there at the whiteboard and I had this conversation with him, and I said, "How can I do that? I can't do that in school." And then he just said, "Exactly." And then that was the end of the conversation. And I knew then that I had to go teach people about him. And so I didn't sign my school contract. Everybody thought I was nuts. And because I worked hard, going to college and things for it. And so I didn't sign my contract. Instead, I got signed up through Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kentucky, took online courses for my master's in education. And at the same time, of course, was getting discipled with the Baptist church. We had switched to the Southern Baptist church at that time. And so I was getting discipled through that. And eventually an Indian man named Eddie Lindsay came to our church. He's a church planter from Oklahoma. And he came to the church here in Kotzebue, to the Baptist church, and he met my wife and I, and he invited himself to our apartment for dinner. And then he says, "Lance, I want you to write on a piece of paper for me the churches that are in Kotzebue." So I wrote them all down. And then he said, "How many people go to church on any given Sunday? Just guess." And so I wrote a number next to each church, and then we added them up, and it was about 300 people that went to church on any given Sunday. And then he says, "How many people live in your town?" And I said, 3,000. So he says, "About 10% go to church on Sunday." And I said, "Wow, that's interesting. I never thought about it that way. I thought we were a pretty Christian place." And so he said, "I'll bet not all 10% are Christians, true followers of Christ." And I thought, yeah, that's true. So he said, "Well, how many, take a guess then?" And I said, "Maybe 7% are true Christians. Like if Jesus were to come, they would go to heaven." And so he said, "Well, as long as 93% are lost, lads, there's always room for another church." And I remember I said, "Well, why can't I just eventually pastor this church?" He says, you can't. You could." He says, "Not going to work out for you. This is a white church. You're an Eskimo." And I said, "It doesn't matter, does it?" And he said, "No, it does matter." He says, "You didn't build this church, and you didn't start this church." He says, "You need to plant your own." So he took me to a bunch of church planting seminars with North American Mission Board throughout the states in Georgia, North Carolina, California, paid my way and really mentored me. And eventually he started at camps in Alaska, mainly in Wasilla near Anchorage down there, and called them Native Youth Camp. And he wanted to create indigenous workers for the indigenous harvest field because the Baptist works were pretty much dead. So he wanted to start with teenagers. And so we started these youth camps down in Wasilla. My wife and I helped him. In fact, I'll never forget, I was in a van outside of Walmart with a bunch of Native kids, and they were going to get some, snacks and things before we head out to this camp, to the campground. And then Eddie Lindsay said, "Hey, listen, I want you to give tonight's devotion." And I said, "What's a devotion?" He just laughed. He says, "You don't even know what a devotion is?" I said, "No, dude, I don't even know, I don't know anything, man. I don't even know songs or nothing." And so they told me what a devotion was. And sure enough, I just sat in the van and wrote my devotion. And it was kind of an interesting one. But anyways, I started at my ministry kind of in youth camp. And I never forget, I was reading in the Bible about Jesus saying, that nobody puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, it'll burst. And so he says, you put new wine into new wineskins. And so I thought, well, I guess we're putting new wine into new wineskins right now. We're putting a new teaching into new students who know really not much. And so, I really took to youth ministry because they're, what do you call it? It's a canvas that's not painted yet. Eventually we got started in 2004. And, I got to be in the inner workings of the Alaska Baptist Convention throughout those years. And then I remember just kind of seeing, not necessarily, there was some level of corruption, but, it just wasn't like godly so much. And there was just some situations there that weren't very godly. And so I realized that, if I'm going to do any work, I need to leave the Baptist Convention and start my own work. Of course, the Baptists didn't like that. They always told me that all the money and the manpower lies with the Baptists. And that if I ever leave, I'll have no money and I'll have nothing, no manpower, no nothing to help me with anything. And that it's unbiblical to be out from the umbrella of the church. But, like I said, it was pretty corrupt and I was like, I got to get out. So in 2009, Corinne and we left the Alaska Baptist Convention and moved back to Kotzebue. And we started our own church in our living room, and we started our own youth camps up here, and both became very fruitful. And the house church was interesting because I read a book called Tangible Kingdom by Hugh Halter and Matt May. Very, very important book in my life anyway, and talked about the tangible kingdom and the forgotten ways, another book by Alan Hirsch. And it talked about basically the New Testament church, the book of Acts church, how they met daily and they gave to each other as they had need. They learned from the apostles' teaching and daily got it added to their number. And so Tangible Kingdom really talks about the current church system, basically that was formed under Constantine, 300 AD, and how Constantine really ruined it, and that how almost every single denomination has Constantinian DNA. What Constantine did was he took the house churches and he said, look, why are you guys doing house churches? We'll build you a big building, just meet there. Just meet on the Lord's Day, meet on Sundays. And so eventually just watered it down. Why are you praying for pastors? We'll hire pastors for you. And so, eventually what you see now in the Church of God, the Assembly of God, the Friends Church, the Southern Baptist, the Independent Baptist, it don't matter. What you see at the building with pews, professionals, and programs. And it's a very Constantinian model. Meet on Sunday and we don't see you the rest of the week. Good luck. And so Tangible Kingdom really kind of changed my view, I guess, of the church. And in Forgotten Ways, Alan Hirsch basically talks about the book of Acts church. And he said that around 90 AD, 100 AD, when the book of Revelation was written, there were about 100,000 Christians then. And at 300 AD, there were nearly 20 million. It grew very fast from 100,000 to that much. And so, anyways, because Constantine did census, what do you call it? He took a number, I guess, of Christians. And so Christianity rose really fast through the house church. But Constantine stopped that. And Forgotten Ways, Alan Hirsch also mentioned the church movement in China, how Americans would go over there and plant churches, and there were about 2 million Christians in China. And then Mao Zedong took over, and for 30 years, he really persecuted the Christians to where they had to do underground churches, house churches. So basically, they were forced to do it the Book of Acts way, to meet daily, meet in the homes, give to each other as they need. And when the Americans came back after Mao Zedong was done, they thought, oh man, there's not going to be many of those 2 million Christians left. That's harsh persecution. And they came back and there were 60 million. And the Americans went, what in the world happened while we were gone? How did it go from 2 million to 60 million? Well, they went back to the old recipe. They went back to the old way in the book of Acts. And so Alan Hirsch asked the question basically in Forgotten Ways, do we need persecution to make the church break through again? Or do we just need to do it the book of Acts way? And so, because you see that all throughout the book of Acts, right? From Jerusalem to Judea, Samaria, ends of the earth, you always see the church grow, and then you see persecution and then scatter. And then the church grow, persecution, scatter. You see this constant thing. And unfortunately, humans, we like to get comfortable. And when we get comfortable, the church doesn't grow. And so oftentimes it takes persecution to scatter the word. But so I thought, okay, well, we'll just have a house church in Kotzebue. We'll do it that way. We'll do it the Book of Acts way. And we did. And it was fine. The only issue is that a lot of the church today is what's called single-parent family ministry. And it's mostly women and divorced women, even single women, mothers, even if they're married, they're still considered a single-parent family because their husband is not so much part of the home. And so when we did our house church, it was mostly young moms with 3 or 4 kids. Well, when you have a house church, right, what are you going to do with all these kids? Put them in a bedroom? In China, they didn't have to worry about that because they didn't bring kids to these underground churches. And they didn't have too many kids anyway. And so the house church model worked great in China. It just can't work great in Alaska, rural Alaska, where there's a lot of kids. And so eventually, we began to do evangelism in the villages and preach and teach. And our youth camps really took off. And so we got the attention of Change Point Church in Anchorage, the biggest church in Alaska. And their mission is life in Christ for every Alaskan and the world beyond. Now, life in Christ for every Alaskan. Now, every Alaskan, there's 100,000 natives, right, from 9 tribes. And so at first they tried to reach the natives by themselves, but they realized eventually after a few years they couldn't. And so they knew they had to get a native to reach natives. And so they began their search for native ministers. And there aren't too many in Alaska. And so they found us, Karina and I, what we were doing already. And they said, how'd you like to partner with us? And we said, well, we've already tried to partner with the Baptists, and that didn't go too well. I said, the only way that we can partner with you is if we're autonomous. We have to be able to do what we want to do, when we need to do it, how we need to do it. You can't have any say. And, you just be the resource and the support and the help. And they're like, yeah, let's do it. And so started an incredible partnership. And there still is no partnership that I know of like that in Alaska. Because if you read Revolution and World Missions by K.P. Yohannan, very good book, the Western Church really, it thinks that it has all the answers and that it knows the best. And if it takes on an indigenous church, they feel that they have to do everything or whatever, and they won't give money to an indigenous church. They just don't have faith that an indigenous church can also be successful. And so, fortunately for us, Change Point was really the only church. You look at some of the other churches, like at the time, Anchorage Baptist Temple or Bircher Community Church or Rabbit Creek Community Church in Anchorage, some of the big churches, right? And they don't have a rural ministry like this, mostly because they want to be the biggest tree on the apple, or the biggest apple on the tree. That's kind of the church growth model, be the biggest, shiniest apple on the tree. And rather than being the apple that produces the most seeds, that produces the most trees, that produce other apples. And so Change Point got that, and it's been an incredible partnership ever since. We're together, we're doing youth camps and things, and some pretty interesting we call it out-of-the-box strategy right now. Yeah, that's what's going on with us currently. The major outreach for us, especially, is youth. And we've reached over 600 youth in 15 years. And in our area, it has the second highest rate of suicides in the nation per capita. And so, fortunately for us, none of the 600 youth that we've ministered to over these years have killed themselves. None of them, zero. That's a pretty interesting. It's a very interesting statistic.
Yes, because I had heard that was one of the big deals in Alaska, period, not just your area, was there's a high suicide rate. Go ahead, though.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. So like, youth come to our church and stuff like that, and the question is, though, how eventually are we going to become self-sustaining here? We have the big mama church, Change Point in Anchorage, who keeps us afloat at the moment, but I had a vision years ago through God to become start a business with this building that we're renting and that we're living in. We convinced Change Point to buy this big building, this Wien Hotel. And so we just turned the back half into this building. It's 100 feet long by 50 feet wide, 2 stories. So we turned the back half into apartments and to rent, because you got to make money. You can't survive off of tithes anymore. A, there's not many people coming to church, and B, the ones who are coming to church don't tithe very much anymore. And so you've got to have another way of income for a church, really. And so for us, that's with this building. So with the help of Samaritan's Purse and just out-of-the-box thinking and Christians coming up and giving their life and serving, with their skills and abilities and experience, they're renting right now as we speak. There's 12 units back here in this big building. And Cornerstone Construction, Christian construction company out of Anchorage, God worked it out to where this Christian company got a contract up here for 2 years to build some patient housing for the hospital. And they needed apartments for their construction workers. And so they're renting all 12 units right now. And so, Lord willing, I think at the end of 2 years, it'll make over $1 million.
It sounds like to me what you're saying is you're on mission. God has given you a mission. And the mission doesn't change if you have money or if you don't have money, but you have to find a way to provide for your family, provide for the church that you have. If the people can't give, then you find a way to make sure that you're honoring your commitments and doing what you can. That's what I'm hearing. It may not be what you're saying, but that's what I'm hearing.
I think it just depends, but like a lot of these buildings are empty. The Friends Church, the Church of God, and and they're decent buildings. So, and what you do is you just look at the needs in your community. There's a huge need for childcare. There's no daycare facility at all here in Kotzebue. And the businesses actually got the churches together one time and bought everybody breakfast and said, hey, are you willing to open your doors and start a daycare center? And so, unfortunately, the churches aren't equipped, don't have the experience or knowledge, expertise, to run something. I'm sure they would like if that company would already just do it and just lease the building throughout the week, then the church would be fine. But they're asking the church to run the daycare center. But, you can have a daycare center or a hair salon or, whatever kind of biggest needs you have in your community, you might as well do it because you got the building. And then they're like, go ahead and proselytize the kids if you want. Go ahead and tell them about Christ. And it's your daycare. Make it a Christian daycare.
Wow. The fact that they're saying that's great. Go ahead.
So anyways, there's all these things, right? And eventually we want to build our own building here, our own youth center, basically, where we can disciple kids throughout the year. And we're going to get Samaritan's Purse to come and help us and build us a big building. And eventually they want to build us a permanent youth camp up the river where we can run 300 to 500 youth in the summer. And so, yeah, those are some big things, right? And then, of course, the rent from these apartments will help just completely pay for the ministry so that we're self-sustaining. And then the Mama Church Chain Point, she can go plant another one somewhere else. And that's what's going on here. I think a couple of things. Number one, years ago when I was an assistant pastor at another church, there was a Chinese man And he came to our church in Eagle River one time. I was an assistant pastor, and he said he wanted to meet with me in the main pastor. So we met. We had lunch, and this guy had this photograph book, huge book. He says, turn to any page, and we turned to any page, right? And it's a photo album basically, and there's a picture of 50 people on this page, and there's a picture of 3,000 people on the other page. And on the bottom of each corner, there's 4 people, and they all have a certain color T-shirt. And then you turn the page, and there's a group of 300 people, and then there's a group of 500 people. And you turn the page, and there's a group of 50 people, there's a picture of 2,000 people. But each one of them had these 4 people in the bottom corners with certain colored shirts. And so we said, well, what is that? And he said there was an American businessman who went down, where is it? I forget where, but he, to this Antioch, this sending tree, he got this church, I think, in terms of business. And so what he did was he told his big church down there, he said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to put a big map of the world. And he said, half of the church is going to stay and half of y'all are going. And everybody's like, wait, what? And he's like, yeah, half of you are staying, half of you are going. The half that stay, you're going to fund and, support the people that are going. So he says, you got 2 weeks, you need to pray. Find out who's going, who's staying. And again, it was a huge, huge church, an Antioch Ascending Church. So anyways, they did, right? And so then the ones that are going, he sat them down with that big old map, and he said, he's labeled the countries with different colors, all the countries. And he said, I want you to pray about which country, God might be calling you. So they prayed about it, and people wrote down what country they're going to go to, Africa or, what continent and stuff. And some people chose the North American continent, African continent, Australia, different places. And then eventually countries. And then he grouped them into groups of 4. And so let's say the United States of America, and there's a big country, and so there's a group of 4, and he would tell that group of 4, because it might be 2 couples in the sending church, it might be a couple and 2 singles, it might be 4 singles, you never know. But either way, they would live together. They would live together for a few months down there while they're still at the Antioch church. And their job is then to live together, to know each other, learn each other, but also to look at the country that they're going to, look at the worldview, and figure out how they're going to evangelize that area and start a home Bible study. And so after 3 months, they would learn all their quirks and all their issues, and who's a good cook, who's not a good cook, and which way to put the roll of tissue on the thing, and forward or backward or what, So eventually they would then go and move, and then they would start a home Bible study. And they start a home Bible study, and it would grow. And then he says after 3 years, what would happen is 2 of them can come back to the mama church, and you get another 2 from the mama church to take their place. And then after 1.5 years, the other 2 go back. And it keeps switching, so you always have 4. And the 2 that go back, they can't be back for longer than 6 months. They have to either, go back to the same place or pray about and go another place. They're always apostles. They're always sent ones. They're not sitting ones. And so, anyways, this guy Ron Ong from China was telling us this, right? And he said, I was one of the ones, he said, what was interesting is some of the first harvest from this Antioch church were millionaires. And we were like, what? He said, yeah. He said, God must have known that the mama church couldn't support that many people for that long. And the first harvest were a lot of rich people. And he says, I was one of them. I was a millionaire. I think he worked for Texas Instruments in China, big company, and made calculators and whatnot. And, eventually became a Christian because of a house church there. And then, he became part of this system. So he said, well, Ron, what are you doing in Alaska? he says, man, I'll tell you what, we at this Antioch church, we can't figure it all out. You guys are crazy. You guys got, urban places like Anchorage and Fairbanks and Wasilla and Kodiak. And he said, then most of your villages are all rural. There's no roads connecting them. And there's 9 different tribes. And Alaska is just a different duck. And we can't figure you guys out, man. There's no one worldview we can look at and study. And so he said, so I've come to you so that you can be the Antioch church in Alaska. And you put a map of Alaska and you color code it with the tribes and whatnot. And then you send out half your people. You do what we did. And so that was an interesting conversation. And again, what was interesting is that when you look at all these pages, must have been 300 pages of churches, 300 of them. And it was just, he said, yeah, our church is worldwide now, 20 times larger now than the sending church down there. And so it was pretty interesting, this American businessman strategy. And so anyways, it's a great idea. Unfortunately, the pastor that I was working with, I don't know, he didn't want to do that. And so we never did it. But it's always been in the back of my mind. And, God has called me to really reach the circumpolar north, really, not only the folks here in Alaska, but also in Canada and in Greenland. And so what I'm doing now is, you can do that. But the issue is that most people that do go to church now don't really know the Bible well enough to start a home Bible study. And so because I have a teaching background, I can create materials and curriculum. And so right now I'm devising a system, almost like Rick Warren's Purpose-Driven Church, where it's a baseball field with home base and first base, second base, third. And from home base to first is knowing Christ. And I'm writing 40 little lessons in there for people to go through on their own, at their own time, at their own pace, their own place too. And we're going to have it online and everything. And so, people from anywhere, any time can go through it, whether they're in Iqaluit, Canada, or whether they're in China. And they can go through it and learn about Christ and learn about what he did. They can learn God's part in the whole plan of salvation. And then they're going to learn man's part. What is man's part, right? And Jesus even said the work of God is this, to believe in the one that the Father sent. And so basically believe in Jesus, 4 words. And so the issue is that with most Americans, most churches now, is they don't really understand that word believe. The word believe in Hebrew is amen, A-M-A-N. Abram believed and it was credited to him righteousness in Genesis 15:6. And that word believe comes from their society where they would put tent pegs into the ground and where they would put nails into wood, and where, it's going to be a completely solid surface that you're pounding this in. Imagine putting a 16-penny nail into a piece of hardwood, right? You ain't getting that nail back. It's not coming back out. And it's sure, it's steady, it's secure, right? It's steadfast. And that's really the basis of that word belief in Hebrew. Abram had such a strong, steady, firm belief in what God was going to do through him that he believed in God, and he amened God. The other context in the Hebrew life is the baking of bread. That's an interesting one too, where they get the word believe. They would make their dough almost like a little football with their hands, and they stick it on a cone-shaped oven. They have a fire inside, and there's a clay oven, and they stick it on the outside. Well, when the dough falls the first time, they pick it up and set it to the other side. When the dough falls the second time, that bread just amened. And you're like, what do you mean that bread just amened? How could the bread believe it? Don't have a brain. Well, no. The Hebrew people understood what happened to that bread, and they wanted to use that happening and connect it to the word believe. And so what happened was, in the dough, you can get your water, your flour, your sugar, and your yeast back. But when it bakes, you can get your water back and your flour back. It's a done deal. There's this bonding that happens in such a way that you can't get these ingredients back again anymore at all. And so they use that in their culture and their language for this word believe. Abraham believed God. He used to be like these ingredients that can separate, but when he put his faith into God, it wasn't so much his faith, it was who he put his faith into. That's the word amen. And I think a lot of Americans don't understand that. They go to a church service and they say, hey, just receive God into your heart, receive Christ into your heart or something. But they don't really understand that with Abram, he gave his whole being, his whole life. He staked his whole life on who God was and what God said he was going to do. And so I think that that's really needed now, is that people aren't getting the information that they need to make that educated decision from the church. Because the churches are all preaching on so many different things. One's on marriage, one's on finances, one's on this, one's on the book of this book or that book or whatever. And nobody's getting like the complete picture as a whole. And so I want to do that for people. And then from first base to second base is growing in Christ. And in that one, it's pretty simple. Jesus said, if you love me, obey my commands, right? And so he says, and then you think, okay, the 10 Commandments? He's like, no. He said, obey my commands. And so when you look through the 4 Gospels, there's a billion commands in there. He says, love your neighbor as yourself. Don't judge. Do this. Don't do that. And so what I really want to do is I want to help Christians, because they're like, okay, how do I live my life now that I'm a Christian? And there have been so many kind of ideas as to how to do that and books written on it, whatnot. But really, you have to go back to the scripture.
Well, Lance, I'm looking forward to talking to you again sometime. And listen, you've got my number. I've got yours. Text me. Call me anytime. God bless you. God bless your wife. It sounds like you are making a major impact on your world, and that will make an impact on the rest of the world. And you understand that, I know. Bless you, brother. Any last words you want to say to youth workers or people in ministry out there like yourself?
I just encourage people really to look at the Jewish perspective, the Jewish language, the Jewish culture, and it'll make the Bible be in color instead of black and white. And, there's enough resources, I think, now to look at things. I'll just end with Ray Vanderlaan. Search up Ray Vanderlaan, and he's a tour guide in Israel, and he teaches Christian high school in Michigan. And I learned a lot from him because he learned from the Jewish perspective of things. And it really just kind of helps make the scripture sense and make it sense, and then gives you deeper devotion, deeper worship. And so that's my challenge to the students and people listening online, and then get a hold of these books. Tangible Kingdom by Hugh Halter. I'm reading Epic of Eden, and it's by Sandra Richter. That's a super good book. So, yeah, never stop learning. Keep on going.
Stay warm up there.
All right, Doug, we'll see you.
This is warm for you. It's not warm for us. When I looked, I think it's 23 degrees today up there. Is that right?
It's 23, yep, and the wind chill's probably down to 0.
And we call that spring.
Yeah.
All right, brother, God bless. We'll talk to you next time. Reach out to me anytime, okay?
All right, Doug, thank you, bye.
You've been listening to the Youth Worker on Fire podcast. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and tell your friends. Also, leave a comment and tell us what you think. Stay tuned for more informative episodes.